The sterile beep of the heart monitor was the only company Marco had. He lay there, his body broken from the grease fire and the fall, waiting for the one face that promised to be there, in sickness and in health. But the visitor's chair remained empty, cold, and mocking. It wasn't until the iPad she left behind lit up with a notification from a man named Julian that the physical pain was eclipsed by something far more agonizing. The realization that while he was fighting for his life, she was busy starting a new one. If stories about the quiet fury of a betrayed man and the long, cold road to justice resonate with you, stay with me. We are about to unravel a deception that took 5 years to build and one night to destroy. The kitchen of Harborview Restaurant moved with the chaotic precision of a war zone. It was 8 p.m. on a Friday in Chicago, and the tickets were printing with a relentless rhythmic screech that haunted Marco Rodriguez's dreams. Order in 2 ribeyes, mid-rare, 1 sea bass, 1 risotto, no dairy, the executive chef barked from the pass. Yes, chef, Marco shouted back, his voice hoarse. Sweat trickled down his spine, soaking into his white coat. The air was thick with the scent of searing animal fat, garlic, and the metallic tang of adrenaline. Marco's hands, covered in tiny white scars from a decade of burns and cuts, moved automatically. He was the sous chef, the engine of this machine, the one who made sure the plates looked perfect for the customers sitting in the plush dining room, people who had no idea about the heat and fury behind the swinging double doors. He checked the clock. Savannah would be finishing her shift at the hotel soon. He imagined her tired smile. He had promised to take her out next week, maybe somewhere nice for once, away from the smell of old fryer oil that seemed to seep from his pores. He just needed to get through this rush. Marco watched the deglaze. It happened in a fraction of a second. A line cook knew and panicked, threw a splash of water onto a flare-up in the sauté station instead of smothering it. The explosion was instantaneous. A fireball erupted, a hungry orange beast that roared through the ventilation gap. Marco, standing closest to the fryer, instinctively turned to shield the younger cook. The blast wave of superheated oil and fire slammed into his left side. He didn't scream immediately. The shock stole his breath. He felt the impact, the sudden weightlessness as he slipped on the oil-slicked floor, and then the sickening crunch of his leg twisting beneath him as he hit the quarry tile. Then came the heat, a searing, blinding agony that dissolved the world into white noise. Man down, chef, man down. The sounds of the kitchen, the clatter of pans, the shouting warped into a dull roar. Marco lay on the floor looking up at the fluorescent lights, which now seemed to be swimming underwater. Savannah, he thought, his vision tunneling. I have to call Savannah. Waking up was a slow, painful crawl through broken glass. Marco opened his eyes. The lights were different now, sterile, dim, and steady. The smell of roasted garlic was replaced by the sharp chemical sting of antiseptic and floor wax. He was in a hospital room. He tried to move, but his body screamed in protest. His left arm and side were heavily bandaged, wrapped in thick gauze. His leg was elevated, encased in a cast. A morphine drip hummed quietly beside him, a synthetic lifeline, keeping the worst of the fire at bay. He turned his head, fighting the stiffness in his neck. He expected to see her. He needed to see her. In the movies, the wife is always there, sleeping in the uncomfortable chair, holding the husband's hand, her makeup smudged from tears. But the chair beside his bed was empty. It was perfectly pushed in the vinyl seat, cold and untouched. Marco swallowed, his throat dry as sandpaper. He looked at the wall clock. 3:14 a.m. How long had he been out? A day, too. On the bedside table, amidst a pile of unopened medical pamphlets and a plastic pitcher of water, lay a sleek silver iPad. It was Savannah's. She must have been here. Relief washed over him, momentarily dulling the throbbing in his burns. She had been here, and she had probably just gone to the cafeteria or the restroom. She had left her iPad, her prized possession, so she couldn't have gone far. He reached out with his good hand, his fingers trembling. He wanted to see her face, even if just in a photo. He pressed the home button. The screen lit up. It wasn't password protected. She usually kept it that way at home for their shared Netflix account. But it wasn't Netflix on the screen. It was iMessage. The device had synchronized with her phone, which must have been nearby recently. A stream of notifications cascaded down the lock screen, all from a contact saved as JSJ. JSJ, 3:10 a.m. Did he wake up yet? I need you back at the suite. The sheets are cold. JSJ, 3:11 a.m. Don't worry about the hospital bill. The restaurant's insurance will cover the damage. Just make sure you get the check before you leave him. JSJ, 03:12 a.m. Come on, Sav. You're too pretty to be sitting in a burn ward smelling like disinfectant. Come home to me. Marco stared at the words. The light from the screen was the only illumination in the room, casting a ghostly blue pallor over his bandaged face. The morphine couldn't touch this pain. This was a different kind of burn, one that went deeper than skin searing through muscle and bone, straight into the heart of the man who had worked 14-hour shifts to buy her the very iPad he was holding. The silence in the room was deafening. Marco closed his eyes just as the heavy door swung open. The rhythm of his heart monitor sped up a treacherous staccato that he prayed she wouldn't notice. The footsteps that entered weren't the soft, shuffling soles of a nurse. They were the sharp, authoritative clicks of high heels, Savannah's favorites, the black stilettos he had saved up 3 months of tips to buy her for their anniversary. Mrs. Rodriguez, a nurse's voice asked softly. Yes. Is there any change? Savannah's voice was pitched perfectly tremulous, laced with just the right amount of fatigue and worry. It was a performance. Marco lay still, regulating his breathing, forcing his body to remain heavy and limp despite the fire burning across his skin. He's stable, but the burns are severe. The grafts will need time, and the leg fracture was complex. He'll be out of work for at least 6 months, the nurse explained. There was a pause, a silence that stretched too long. 6 months, Savannah repeated, her tone hardening slightly. And the workers' compensation? The insurance settlement from the restaurant owner? When does that process start? You'd have to speak with the hospital administrator and his employer about that, ma'am. Our priority right now is his survival. Right, of course. Survival. Marco heard the rustle of her coat as she sat down in the vinyl chair, the same chair that had been empty all night. He waited until the nurse checked his vitals and left the room. As soon as the door clicked shut, the performance dropped like a heavy curtain. God, it smells like antiseptic and burnt meat in here, Savannah muttered. Marco cracked his eyelids open just a slit. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at her reflection in the darkened window, fixing a strand of her blonde hair. She looked immaculate. No dark circles, no red eyes. She looked like she was ready for a gala, not a vigil. She reached for the iPad on the table. Marco's breath hitched. If she checked it, she would see the messages were read. But she didn't unlock it. She just shoved it into her oversized designer bag and pulled out her phone instead, typing furiously. A moment later, her phone rang. She answered on the first ring, her voice dropping to a hush. I'm here. It's depressing. No, he's still out cold. The nurse said 6 months, Julian. 6 months of him sitting on the couch. Yeah, I know. I asked about the check. If the settlement is what we think it is, it'll be enough for the down payment on the condo. I know, baby. I miss you too. His hands. I can't even look at them. They were rough before, but now it's disgusting. She laughed softly. It was a cruel tinkling sound that shattered whatever was left of Marco's heart. Okay, I have to go pretend to care for a bit. I'll be back at the hotel by 8. Order me the lobster. She hung up and finally turned to look at him. Marco closed his eyes, fully focusing on the darkness. He felt her hand hover over his uninjured shoulder, then pull back as if she couldn't bring herself to touch him. Just die or get better, Marco, she whispered, her voice devoid of warmth. Don't just stay in the middle. You're dragging me down. She stood up and walked to the door. I'm going to get coffee, she said to the empty room, establishing her alibi. The moment the door closed, Marco opened his eyes. The pain in his leg was throbbing a deep bone-grinding ache, but his mind was crystal clear. He wasn't just a husband who had been cheated on. He was a nuisance, an obstacle, a funding source. They were waiting for the settlement money paid for his flesh and blood to start their new life together. They planned to take the check and leave him with the scars. He looked at the empty table where the iPad had been. He didn't need it anymore. He had seen enough. The JSJ was Julian St. James, the man Marco had cooked for once at a private event, the man who owned the hotel where Savannah worked, a man who had everything and now wanted the little that Marco had. Marco stared at the ceiling. Tears leaked from the corners of his eyes, tracking through the soot and salve on his cheeks, but his expression remained stone cold. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of a confrontation. He wouldn't give them the drama they expected from a low-class cook. He looked at the IV line in his arm. He looked at the cast on his leg. 6 months, the nurse had said. Tonight, Marco decided. He wouldn't be there when the settlement check arrived. He wouldn't be there when she came back from her coffee. If he stayed, he would kill them. If he left, he might just survive long enough to destroy them. With a groan that he stifled between clenched teeth, Marco pushed himself up. The room spun violently. He gripped the bed rail, his knuckles white. The monitor beeped faster, warning him, but he ignored it. He had a kitchen to clean, and the first step was taking out the trash. The silence of the room was no longer a prison. It was an opportunity. Marco stared at the IV line in his arm, the clear tube snaking up to the bag of fluids that kept him tethered to this bed, to this life. He didn't rip it out like they did in the movies. He wasn't dramatic. He was a chef. He was precise. With his good hand, he carefully peeled back the tape, found the valve, and shut off the flow. He slid the needle out with a sharp intake of breath, pressing a wad of gauze against the puncture until the bleeding slowed. Next came the hardest part. He swung his legs over the side of the bed. The cast on his left leg felt like an anchor dragging him down. As his feet touched the cold linoleum, a bolt of white-hot lightning shot up his thigh. He bit his lips so hard he tasted copper, a stifled groan vibrating in his chest. He sat there for a minute, sweating, trembling, waiting for the black spots in his vision to clear. He couldn't leave in a hospital gown. He needed his dignity. He dragged himself to the narrow closet near the bathroom. His clothes from the accident were there in a clear plastic bag labeled patient belongings. They smelled of smoke and charred fabric. His chef's coat was ruined, cut open by the paramedics, but his jeans were intact, though stiff with soot. He found his boots. One fit, the other he couldn't get over the cast. He jammed his foot into the boot, leaving the laces loose, and limped back to the bed using the IV pole as a crutch. He grabbed his phone from the bedside table. His fingers, stiff and burnt, danced over the screen. He opened his banking app. Joint checking $14,250. It was their life savings. The money for the house. The money she claimed wasn't enough. Marco transferred exactly $7,125 to his personal external account, an old account he hadn't used since before they were married. He didn't take a penny more. He wasn't a thief. He wasn't her. He left the other half for her, a final severance package for a marriage that had been dead for years. Then the ring. He twisted the gold band off his finger. It left a pale indentation on his skin, a ghost of a commitment. He looked at the plastic pitcher of water on the table, the water she hadn't poured for him, the water he had thirsted for, while she texted her lover. He dropped the ring into the pitcher. It sank with a soft clink, resting at the bottom, magnified and distorted by the water. No note, no explanation. The ring in the water said everything I was drowning, and you let me sink. The hallway was quiet. The night shift nurses were gathered at the station, laughing softly over coffee, their backs turned. Marco waited for the heavy double doors at the end of the corridor to swing open as an orderly pushed a cart through. He moved. Every step was a battle. He used the wall for support, sliding along the shadows. The pain was a living thing clawing at his leg, his side, his burnt arm. But the rage was a better anesthetic than morphine. He made it to the service elevator, pressed the button, and held his breath. When the doors opened to the ground floor, the cold air of the loading dock hit him. It was a Chicago winter, brutal and unforgiving. The wind cut through his thin shirt, stinging his burns, but it felt clean. It felt real. He hailed a cab on the corner 3 blocks away from the hospital entrance. He collapsed into the back seat, his body finally giving out. "Where to, pal?" the driver asked, eyeing Marco's battered appearance in the rearview mirror. "Greyhound Station," Marco rasped, "and keep the heat off." As the cab pulled away, Marco didn't look back at the hospital. He didn't look back at the skyline where Savannah was likely sleeping in Julian's high thread count sheets. Marco Rodriguez died in that hospital room tonight. The man sitting in the cab, shivering and broken, was someone else entirely. Someone who had nothing left to lose, and therefore was the most dangerous man in the world. He watched the city lights blur into streaks of gold and red. He was disappearing into the gray, into the cold. He would heal. He would rebuild. And one day when the frost thawed, he would return. Cleveland was colder than Chicago. The wind coming off Lake Erie didn't just bite, it chewed. Marco rented a room in a motel that smelled of stale cigarettes and damp carpet, paying cash weekly. For the first month, he didn't leave the room except to buy protein bars, painkillers, and rubbing alcohol. He became his own doctor. He cut the cast off himself using tin snips bought from a hardware store, biting down on a leather belt to keep from screaming as the vibration rattled his unhealed fracture. The leg was stiff, atrophied, and ugly, but it was his. The burns on his side healed into a map of shiny keloid scars, a permanent reminder of the fire that had burned away his old life. He didn't look at photos of Savannah. He didn't check her social media. He focused entirely on the pain. Pain was useful. It was fuel. By the second winter, Marco Rodriguez had ceased to exist. In his place was a man who went by his middle name Sterling. He got a job as a dishwasher in a high-volume steakhouse. It was humiliating work for a sous chef scraping half-eaten potatoes into the trash, but he needed to be invisible. He watched the kitchen from the scullery. He watched the mistakes, the waste, the inefficiencies. At night, while the other cooks went out to drink, Sterling went to the public library. He didn't read cookbooks anymore. He read books on corporate strategy, hospitality law, and forensic accounting. He studied the St. James Hotel chain like an adversary studying a battlefield. He learned their supply chains, their profit margins, and their debt structures. He realized that Julian St. James wasn't a genius. He was a trust fund kid playing hotelier, leveraging assets to cover operational bleed. By year 3, Sterling had moved to New York. He wasn't washing dishes anymore. He was a turnaround consultant for failing restaurants. He had a gift. He could walk into a kitchen, spot the money leak in 10 minutes, and fix it. He was ruthless. He fired lazy staff, renegotiated vendor contracts, and redesigned menus. He didn't make friends. He made profits. His appearance changed. The scruffy beard was groomed into sharp lines to hide the jaw tension. The chef's whites were replaced by tailored charcoal suits that hid the burn scars. He wore glasses not because his vision was poor, but because they created a barrier, a glass wall between him and the rest of the world. Year 5 brought the opportunity he had been crafting. He was sitting in his minimalist apartment in Brooklyn, the skyline glittering outside when the alert popped up on his laptop. He had set a Google alert for St. James Hotel Chicago plus gala. St. James Chicago announces 10th anniversary gala. Owner Julian St. James expected to announce major expansion in personal milestone. The article featured a photo. Julian looking smug in a tuxedo with Savannah on his arm. She looked different, harder, thinner, her smile tight. She was wearing diamonds that Marco could never have afforded. But Marco noticed something else. Julian's hand wasn't resting possessively on her waist. It was in his pocket. Savannah was leaning in, but Julian was leaning away. There was a crack in the facade. Marco picked up his phone. He dialed a number he had secured months ago, the private line of the St. James Board of Directors. "This is M.R. Sterling." He said, his voice dropping an octave, smooth and cold as a frozen lake. "I understand your Chicago flagship is hemorrhaging money in its food and beverage department. I have a proposal to fix it before your gala. But I work alone and I answer only to the board, not to Mr. St. James." He paused, listening to the desperate interest on the other end of the line. "My fee is substantial," Marco added, staring at the photo of his wife on the screen. "But the results will be unforgettable." He hung up. He walked to the mirror in the hallway. The man looking back wasn't the chef who had begged for love. He was a man who had survived the winter of his soul. He adjusted his tie, covering the scar tissue at the base of his neck. It was time to go home. Chicago welcomed him back with a sleet storm that turned the streets into rivers of gray slush. It was fitting. The last time Marco had felt this city's air, he was limping into a cab, broken and penniless. Now he stepped out of a black town car, an umbrella immediately snapped open by a doorman who didn't look him in the eye, not out of disrespect, but out of deference. He walked through the revolving brass doors of the St. James Hotel and inhaled. The scent was the same white tea time and old money. It was a smell that used to make him feel small, a reminder of the world he merely serviced, but didn't inhabit. Now it just smelled like a target. "Mr. Sterling." The general manager, a nervous man named Elias who had been hired 2 years ago, hurried across the marble lobby. He extended a hand which Marco took firmly but briefly. Welcome to the St. James. The board spoke very highly of your work in New York. We're, we're desperate. The gala is in 3 weeks, and the tasting menu is a disaster. I don't need the backstory, Elias. Marco said, his voice low and devoid of inflection. I need the kitchen access codes, the P&L statements for the last 4 quarters, in total autonomy. No one questions my cuts. No one questions my menu. Is that clear? Of course, Mr. St. James is traveling today, but he is eager to meet you tomorrow. Good, let's get started. Marco spent the first hour touring the kitchen. It was strange walking into a space so similar to the one that had nearly killed him, yet different. The equipment was newer, the staff younger. None of the old crew remained. The turnover in this industry was brutal. He watched the line cooks prepping for dinner service, the frantic chopping, the sweat, the fear in their eyes when the executive chef yelled. He felt a phantom heat on his scarred side, a memory of fire, but he pushed it down. He wasn't one of them anymore. He was the man holding the axe. He moved to the mezzanine level, a balcony that overlooked the sprawling lobby. He ordered a sparkling water and stood by the railing looking down. That was when he saw her. Savannah. She was standing near the concierge desk, but she wasn't working behind it. She was standing in front of it dressed in a cream-colored cashmere coat that probably cost more than Marco's old annual salary. Her hair was cut shorter, a sharp angular bob that framed her face severely. She was gesturing at a bellhop, her finger pointing imperiously at a luggage cart. Marco watched unblinking. 5 years. He had played this moment over in his head 1,000 times. He expected his heart to race. He expected rage or maybe a lingering pang of the love he once held for her. Instead, he felt nothing. Just a clinical observation. He watched as she snapped her fingers, a gesture she used to hate when customers did it to her. The bellhop scrambled. She checked her reflection in a pillar mirror smoothing her coat. She looked polished, hardened, and undeniably beautiful in a manufactured way. She was the queen of the castle she had stolen. Mrs. St. James is very particular, Elias whispered, appearing beside Marco. Technically, she's not Mrs., yet the wedding is at the gala, but she runs the front of house like she owns the deed. She seems efficient, Marco said, testing the water. Efficient is one word, Elias muttered, checking to make sure no one was listening. Terrifying is another. She fired 3 maids last month for not folding the towels in a swan shape correctly. But while the boss adores her, or at least he pays for everything. Marco took a sip of his water. Interesting. Savannah turned, then scanning the lobby, as if she sensed eyes on her. Her gaze swept up to the mezzanine. Marco didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He stood perfectly still, his tinted glasses hiding his eyes, his beard obscuring his jawline. For a second, her eyes locked on his figure. A frown creased her forehead. She squinted, tilting her head slightly. There was a flicker of recognition, a ghost of a memory sparking in her synapses, the posture, the breadth of the shoulders. Then her phone buzzed. She broke eye contact, looked down at the screen, and the moment evaporated. She typed a quick reply, turned on her heel, and marched toward the elevators. Marco watched the elevator doors close, swallowing her whole. She has no idea what's coming, Marco thought, setting his glass down on the railing. The glass made a sharp clink, echoing the sound of a wedding ring dropping into a water pitcher 5 years ago. Show me the private dining room, Marco said to Elias. I have a menu to plan. The executive tasting room was a glass-walled aquarium of privilege located on the top floor. A single slab of black marble served as the table. Marco sat at the head, a dossier of menu concepts spread out before him. He checked his watch. 2:15 p.m. They were 15 minutes late. Power play. He knew it well. When the double doors finally swung open, the air pressure in the room seemed to drop. Julian St. James walked in first. He was taller than Marco remembered, or perhaps Marco had just been kneeling in the dust for so long. Julian wore a navy suit that shouted Italian tailoring. His hair swept back, his smile practiced and hollow. Trailing a step behind him was Savannah. Up close, the changes were even more stark. The girl who used to laugh while eating takeout noodles on their secondhand sofa was gone. This woman moved with a rigid grace, her eyes scanning the room for flaws before they even landed on the people. Mr. Sterling, Julian boomed, extending a hand. Apologies for the delay. The florist for the gala is incompetent. You know how it is. Marco stood slowly. He didn't rush. He buttoned his jacket, a deliberate movement that drew attention to his composure. He took Julian's hand. His grip was iron hard, a contrast to Julian's soft, moisturized palm. "Time is money, Mr. St. James," Marco said, his voice gravelly and flat. "But I assume you can afford it." Julian blinked, surprised by the lack of deference, then laughed. "I like him. Direct. Savannah, darling, this is the miracle worker the board sent. Mr. Sterling." Savannah stepped forward. The scent of her perfume, Chanel number 5, the one she used to say was for old rich ladies, hit Marco like a physical blow. He held his breath for a microsecond, forcing his heart rate to obey his will. "Mr. Sterling," she said, extending her hand. Marco took it. Her skin was cool. He remembered every inch of that hand. He remembered how those fingers had felt threaded through his own. He remembered how they had held the iPad while she typed the messages that destroyed him. "A pleasure, Ms. Moore," Marco said, using her maiden name deliberately. She stiffened slightly. Well, almost Mrs. St. James, soon. "My apologies, the dossier was outdated." He released her hand quickly as if it burned. They sat. Marco began his pitch, projecting images of the proposed courses onto the smart wall. He spoke of deconstructed classics, of molecular gastronomy, of exorbitant ingredients that would appeal to Julian's vanity. Throughout the presentation, he felt Savannah's eyes boring into him. She wasn't looking at the screen. She was looking at his hands as he gestured. She was looking at the way he held his pen. "Stop," Savannah said suddenly, cutting Marco off in the middle of a sentence about truffle foam. The room went silent. Julian looked at her, annoyed. "Savannah, let him finish." "No," she said, narrowing her eyes at Marco. "Your voice. It sounds incredibly familiar. Have we met before, Mr. Sterling? Perhaps in New York, or here in Chicago?" Marco's blood ran cold, but his face remained a mask of bored professionalism. He turned his head slowly, the light catching his tinted glasses, so she couldn't see the depth of his irises. "I have a common voice, I'm told," Marco lied smoothly. "And I have worked in Chicago before, a long time ago, but I doubt our paths crossed. I spent most of my time in the back of house screaming at line cooks. You don't strike me as someone who frequents the scullery." It was a risky jab, a subtle reminder of her roots, but it worked. Savannah flinched, her ego taking the bait over her suspicion. She straightened her spine, defensive. "Certainly not," she sniffed. "I've always been front of house management." "Right," Marco said, holding her gaze until she looked away. "Then it must be a mistake." "The menu looks expensive," Julian interjected, bored with the tension. "Can we execute it?" "Our current staff is lackluster. The last good sous chef we had burned himself out." "Literally," Julian chuckled at his own joke. "Grease fire. Sad story. Cost me a fortune in insurance premiums." Marco felt a muscle in his jaw jump. He picked up his glass of water, the condensation cool against his fingertips. "Fire clears the way for new growth," Marco said softly. "I'll bring in my own team for the lead stations. Your staff will just need to follow orders." "Can they do that?" "They'll do whatever you tell them," Savannah said, her voice regaining its icy edge. "We need this gala to be perfect. If you pull this off, Sterling, you'll be a legend in this city." "I don't care about legends," Marco replied, closing his folder. "I care about results." He stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. As he walked to the door, he felt Savannah's gaze on his back again, heavy and confused. She knew something was wrong. The ghost was in the room, but she couldn't see him through the smoke. "Mr. Sterling," she called out just as he reached the handle. He paused, not turning around. "Yes." "Do you eat meat?" It was a trap. Marco used to be a strict carnivore, famous for his steaks. "I'm strictly pescatarian these days," he lied. "Health reasons. The body changes as we get older, doesn't it?" He walked out before she could answer, leaving her frowning at the empty chair. Outside in the hallway, Marco leaned against the wall, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He clenched them into fists until the knuckles turned white, breathing through his nose until the shaking stopped. Round 1. The following morning, the hotel's atrium restaurant was bathed in a deceptive golden warmth. Marco sat at a corner table concealed behind a tablet and a double espresso. He wasn't there to eat. He was there to study the habitat of his prey. At 9 o'clock a.m. sharp, the royal family arrived. Julian led the way, talking loudly on his phone, ignoring the staff who scrambled to pull out his chair. Savannah followed, looking exhausted despite the layers of concealer, her eyes glued to her own device. But they weren't alone. Trailing behind them was a uniformed nanny, her hand firmly gripping the wrist of a small boy. Marco lowered his tablet. The dossier hadn't mentioned a child. Or perhaps he had been so focused on the financial destruction of the St. James Empire that he had ignored the personal details. He watched as the boy was lifted into a high chair. No, he was too big for a high chair. He was seated in a regular chair with a booster. He looked about 4 years old. Marco's mind, trained to calculate food costs down to the fraction of a cent, began to run a different kind of math. He had left Chicago exactly 5 years and 2 months ago. If Savannah had gotten pregnant immediately or just before he left, the timeline fit. He stared at the boy. The child was quiet, unnaturally so. He didn't fidget or throw food. He sat with his hands folded on the table, staring at the silverware. He had dark curly hair, too dark for Savannah's bleached blonde, and definitely not matching Julian's thinning sandy brown. "Sit up straight, Leo," Julian snapped, snapping his fingers in front of the boy's face without looking away from his phone. "You're slumping. It looks low class." The boy Leo straightened his spine instantly, a reflex born of fear. Marco felt a surge of nausea that had nothing to do with the coffee, the name Leo. It was the name of Marco's grandfather. Savannah knew that. She had once promised him that if they ever had a son, they would name him Leo. Was it a coincidence or a twisted trophy? The waiter arrived with breakfast, pancakes for the boy. Leo reached for the syrup, his small hands shaking slightly. "Careful," Savannah hissed, finally looking up. "Don't get sticky. We have the photo shoot for the magazine at 11. The boy froze. He withdrew his hand, eating the dry pancakes without complaint. Marco watched, transfixed. There was something in the way the boy focused on the plate. He didn't just eat. He dismantled the food. He separated the fruit from the stack, organizing it by color before taking a bite. It was methodical. It was obsessive. It was exactly what Marco used to do. Then the accident happened. A busboy rushing to clear a nearby table clipped the back of the nanny's chair. The jolt knocked a glass of orange juice over. It shattered on the marble floor, splashing onto Julian's Italian leather shoes. "For God's sake!" Julian roared, jumping up. The entire restaurant went silent. "Can't you hire competent help? Look at this $5,000 ruined." He turned his rage on the nearest target. Not the busboy, but Leo, who had flinched and knocked his fork down in the chaos. "And you," Julian pointed a finger at the terrified child. "Stop shaking. You're always so weak. Act like a saint. James, for once in your life." Savannah didn't intervene. She was busy dabbing a napkin on her own skirt, checking for stains. Marco's knuckles turned white as he gripped the edge of his table. The urge to vault over the partition and shatter Julian's jaw was overwhelming. But he couldn't. Not yet. If he moved now, he would be arrested, and Leo would be left in that house of horrors. The busboy was apologizing profusely, on his knees cleaning the mess. Leo climbed down from his chair, trying to help. He picked up a shard of glass. "No!" Savannah shrieked. But before anyone else could move, Marco was there. He hadn't consciously decided to stand up. He had simply moved. He crouched down beside the boy, intercepting his hand just before the sharp glass sliced his palm. "Easy," Marco said, his voice low and steady. He gently pried the glass from the boy's fingers. Leo looked up. For the first time, Marco saw the boy's eyes clearly. They weren't blue like Savannah's. They weren't hazel like Julian's. They were dark, deep brown, almost black. They were Marco's eyes. Time stopped. The noise of the restaurant faded. Marco looked into the face of his son, a son he didn't know existed, a son raising amidst the wolves who had destroyed his father. "Who the hell are you?" Julian barked, looming over them. Marco stood up slowly, shielding Leo with his body. He adjusted his glasses, sliding the mask of M.R. Sterling back into place. "Your son was about to cut an artery, Mr. St. James," Marco said coldly. "I suggest you worry less about your shoes and more about the liability lawsuit if a child bleeds out in your dining room." Julian blinked, taken aback by the rebuke. He looked at Leo, then back at Marco, sneering. "He's clumsy, takes after his mother." "Come on, Leo." the nanny whispered, grabbing the boy's arm and dragging him away. As Leo was pulled away, he looked back over his shoulder. He looked right at Marco. And for a fleeting second, the boy offered a small, hesitant nod, a silent acknowledgement between two survivors. Marco watched them leave. The rage that had been a cold fire in his gut for 5 years suddenly changed. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was a rescue mission. He needed proof. He needed DNA. And once he had it, he wasn't just going to take Julian's money. He was going to take his heir. The kitchen was no longer a place of chaos. Under Marco's command, it had become a silent surgical theater. He stood at the pass, inspecting every plate with the scrutiny of a jeweler. The staff moved around him in terrified orbit, sensing that the man in the charcoal suit was not just a consultant, but an executioner. Tonight was the final menu approval. Julian and Savannah were seated in the private alcove overlooking the kitchen, separated by a pane of soundproof glass. They looked like royalty in a box seat watching the peasants perform. Marco signaled the waiters. Course 3, go. He watched the servers march out in unison. This was the trap. He hadn't chosen lobster or caviar to impress them. He had chosen memory. He walked into the private dining room as the plates were set down. The dish was visually stunning, a deconstructed pasta resting in a foam of aged parmesan, topped with a dusting of gold leaf. But the heart of the dish was simple: cacio e pepe, cheese and pepper. It was the only thing Marco could afford to cook for Savannah during their first year of marriage, when the rent was overdue and the fridge was empty. They would eat it sitting on the floor, laughing, tangling their forks together. It was the taste of their poverty and their love. "What is this?" Julian asked, poking the pasta with disdain. "Macaroni and cheese." "Roman comfort food elevated," Marco said smoothly, standing in the shadows behind Savannah's chair. "I call it the starving artist. It relies on a specific blend of 3 peppers and a pecorino that is aged for 30 months. "Please." Savannah picked up her fork. She looked bored. She sliced into the pasta and took a bite. Marco watched her throat. He saw the moment the taste hit her palate. She froze. The fork clattered onto the china, the noise sharp in the quiet room. Her hand flew to her mouth. It wasn't just the cheese. It was the specific heavy hand with the black pepper, Marco's signature. It was the exact texture of the pasta, rolled slightly thicker than standard. It tasted like the apartment on 4th Street. It tasted like the husband she had left to die. "Is something wrong, darling?" Julian asked, his mouth full. "It's a bit rustic for my taste. Heavy, oily." Savannah was pale, staring at the plate as if it were a severed head. She looked up at Marco, her eyes wide, searching his face for a crack in the mask. "Who gave you this recipe?" she whispered. "It's a classic Mrs. Saint." "James," where Marco replied, his voice devoid of emotion. "Though I tweaked it, I find that sometimes the simplest things are the hardest to forget. Don't you agree?" "It's awful," Julian declared, pushing his plate away. "It tastes like something you'd get in a cafeteria." "Sterling, I thought we were aiming for Michelin stars, not comfort food for the working class." Marco smiled, a cold, thin expression. He turned his gaze to Julian, effectively teaming up with him against Savannah. "You have a refined palate, Mr. St. James. You are correct. It is a peasant dish. I included it because I thought perhaps your fiancé might appreciate a reminder of humbler times. Sometimes people from certain backgrounds crave the taste of home, no matter how much silk they wear." It was a precise, calculated insult. He was calling her low class right to her face in front of the man whose approval she desperately needed. Julian laughed, a cruel barking sound. He looked at Savannah with a sneer. "He's got you there, Sav. You can take the girl out of the trailer park, right?" Savannah's face flushed a deep, humiliated crimson. She looked from Julian, who was mocking her, to Marco, who was watching her with clinical detachment. She was trapped. If she defended the dish, she admitted her low-class roots and her connection to the taste. If she agreed with Julian, she betrayed the only real memory of happiness she had left. "Take it away," Savannah choked out. Pushing the plate so hard, wine sloshed out of her glass. "It's disgusting. I hate it." "As you wish," Marco said. He signaled the waiter to clear the table. "Next time," Marco added, leaning in slightly closer to Savannah than was necessary, "we will stick to things that have no history, purely artificial." Like the decor. Savannah trembled. She grabbed her wine glass and drained it. She was rattled. The foundation was cracking. She sensed a ghost, but she couldn't prove it, and the uncertainty was driving her toward the edge. "I need a smoke," she muttered, standing up abruptly and storming out to the terrace. "Temperamental." Julian sighed, shaking his head. "Women. Good call on the pasta, Sterling. It exposed her lack of taste. Let's stick to the filet for the main. Safe. Expensive." "Agreed," Marco said. "Safe is always better for men with a lot to lose." As Julian pontificated about wine pairings, Marco's eyes drifted to the glass door, where Savannah was frantically lighting a cigarette, her hands shaking. She was breaking, but he wasn't done. He needed one more thing from them. He needed the boy, and tomorrow he would invite the little heir to a special tasting of his own. The opportunity arrived under the guise of market research. Marco had convinced Julian that the gala needed a dedicated children's dessert menu to appeal to the family-oriented investors. Julian, desperate to project the image of a benevolent patriarch, agreed to let Leo serve as the chief tasting officer for an hour. It was 3:00 p.m. on a Tuesday. The main kitchen was in a lull between lunch and dinner service. The stainless steel surfaces gleamed under the harsh lights, sterile and waiting. Leo arrived with the nanny, a young woman named Clara, who spent more time on TikTok than watching her charge. "Mr. Sterling," Clara said, popping gum. "Mrs. St. James said I have to stay. She doesn't want him eating too much sugar." "Understandable," Marco said, his voice smooth. He looked at Clara. "However, the espresso machine in the staff lounge is broken. I have a fresh pot of Jamaican Blue Mountain coffee in my office. Why don't you help yourself? I need the boys' undivided attention for the flavor profile. It will take 10 minutes. Clara hesitated, then shrugged. The promise of free, expensive coffee was too good to pass up. 10 minutes. If he throws up, it's on you." She left. For the first time in 5 years, Marco was alone with his son. Leo sat on a high stool, his legs dangling, looking small and terrified in the vast industrial kitchen. He wore a stiff polo shirt that was buttoned too high. "Relax, Leo," Marco said, dropping the Sterling persona just a fraction. He didn't use the cold corporate tone. He used the voice he used to use when coaxing a shy stray cat. "I'm not going to make you eat anything gross. Do you like hot chocolate?" Leo's eyes widened. He nodded slowly. "Good. But not the powder stuff. Real chocolate." Marco moved to the station. He heated milk and cream, whisking in 70% dark chocolate shavings and a pinch of cinnamon. He worked with a rhythm that was hypnotic. Leo watched, mesmerized by Marco's scarred hands, moving with such grace. "Your hands," Leo whispered. "They look like maps." Marco paused. He looked at his burns. "They are maps. They show where I've been. And they remind me where not to go again." He poured the thick, rich liquid into a small white cup and placed a silver spoon on the saucer. He slid it across the counter to Leo. "Taste it. Tell me if it needs more sugar. Honesty is the only rule in my kitchen." Leo picked up the spoon. He took a tentative sip. Then another. A small, genuine smile broke through his guarded expression. It was the first time Marco had seen the boy smile. It broke his heart and mended it all at once. "It's good," Leo said softly. "It tastes warm." "Drink it up," Marco said, watching every movement. "But leave the spoon." Leo finished the cup, scraping the bottom with the silver spoon, covering it in saliva and chocolate DNA. "Mr. Sterling," Leo asked, putting the spoon down, "are you going to be at the party?" "Yes, Leo, I will be. My dad, Julian, he says parties are for important people. He says I have to be quiet." Marco walked around the counter. He stopped in front of the boy. The urge to hug him was a physical ache, but he held back. "You are important, Leo," Marco said fiercely. "More important than he is. Never forget that." The door to the kitchen swung open. "What is going on here?" It was Savannah. She stood in the doorway, looking from Marco to Leo. Her eyes narrowed on the empty cup. "I told Clara no sugar," she snapped, marching forward. "It was dark chocolate, antioxidants only," Marco said, stepping back into character. "Testing complete. The boy has an excellent palate. Far better than his father's." He reached out and picked up the saucer and the spoon. He did it casually like a waiter clearing a table. "I'll take this to the wash," Marco said. "Come on, Leo." Savannah grabbed the boy's hand roughly. "We're leaving. You have a fitting." She dragged the boy away. Leo looked back at Marco one last time, confusion and gratitude in his eyes. As soon as the door swung shut, Marco moved. He didn't go to the dishwasher. He went straight to his office. He pulled a sterile plastic evidence bag from his drawer bought days ago for this exact moment. He dropped the silver spoon into the bag and sealed it. He held the bag up to the light. The smear of chocolate and saliva was the most valuable thing he had ever possessed. It was the key to the kingdom. He picked up his phone and dialed the courier service he had on standby. "Pick up in 5 minutes," Marco said. "Priority rush to the genetics lab. I need results in 24 hours. Price is no object." He stared at the spoon. "Hang on, kid," he whispered to the empty room. "Daddy's coming." The notification arrived at 11:42 p.m. Marco sat in his temporary apartment, the glow of his laptop screen the only light in the room. Outside, the Chicago wind howled against the glass, a restless beast clawing to get in. On the screen, the email from the private genetics lab sat unread for a full minute. The subject line was Clinical Sterile Reference Case Number 4921-B, Analysis Complete. Marco's hand hovered over the trackpad. For 5 years, he had lived on suspicion and hatred. Opening this file would end the speculation. It would turn a ghost story into a documented reality. He clicked. The PDF loaded. He scrolled past the technical jargon, past the marker comparisons, straight to the bottom of the page. Probability of paternity 99.998%. Conclusion. The donor of sample A, alleged father, cannot be excluded as the biological father of sample B child. Marco stopped breathing. He read the line again and again. The numbers burned into his retinas. Leo was his. The boy with the sad eyes, the boy who organized his fruit by color, the boy Julian, St. James, treated like a defective accessory. He was Marco's flesh and blood. Savannah hadn't just cheated. She hadn't just stolen money. She had kidnapped a life. She had looked Marco in the eye as he lay broken in that hospital bed, knowing she was carrying his child, and she had chosen to pass that child off to another man for a paycheck. A sound escaped Marco's throat, a low guttural noise that was half sob, half growl. He stood up, knocking his chair over. He paced the small room, his hands gripping his hair. The rage that filled him now was different from the cold anger of the last 5 years. This was volcanic. It was a primitive, violent urge to storm the St. James penthouse, kick down the doors, and tear Julian apart with his bare hands. He imagined it. He imagined the feel of his hands around Savannah's throat, demanding to know why. But he stopped. He forced himself to look at his reflection in the darkened window. He saw the scars on his neck. He saw the glasses. He saw Sterling. Violence would get him arrested. Violence would traumatize Leo. Violence was what the old Marco, the hot-headed line cook, would have done. Sterling didn't use violence. Sterling used leverage. He walked back to the computer. He opened the file for tomorrow's gala presentation. It was titled A Decade of Excellence, the Culinary Future of St. James. It was a multimedia presentation meant to run on the massive LED screens in the ballroom while Marco served the final course. It was supposed to show glamour shots of the hotel, the vineyards, the food. Marco began to edit. He didn't just insert the DNA results. That was too crude. He needed a narrative. He accessed a hidden folder on his hard drive, the insurance folder. It contained screenshots of the text messages from 5 years ago. It contained the hospital records. It contained the financial transfers. He began to weave them into the presentation. He synchronized the slides to the timing of the service. Course 1, the appetizer, the illusion of perfection. Course 2, the main, the heavy, meaty truth. Course 3, the dessert, the bitter reality. He worked through the night. He was a composer writing his magnum opus. Every transition, every fade-in was calculated for maximum impact. He wasn't just planning to ruin a party. He was planning a public execution of their reputations. By 4 a.m. it was done. Marco closed the laptop. He felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. It was the mise en place of the mind. Everything was in its place. The ingredients were prepped. The oven was hot. He walked to the window and looked out at the city. In the distance, the St. James Hotel rose like a lit-up tombstone against the night sky. "Enjoy your sleep, Savannah," he whispered to the glass. "It's the last one you'll ever get." He went to his closet and pulled out his suit for tomorrow. Not gray, not charcoal. Black. He was dressing for a funeral. The grand ballroom of the St. James Hotel was a cavern of crystal and light. 500 of Chicago's wealthiest citizens sat at round tables draped in white silk, the air heavy with the scent of orchids and expensive cologne. A string quartet played softly in the corner, masking the sound of silverware scraping against china. Marco stood in the wings of the stage watching. He was dressed entirely in black, a sharp contrast to the sea of tuxedos and shimmering gowns. He felt calm. His pulse was slow, steady, like a drummer keeping time for a funeral march. On the dais, Julian stood with a microphone, a flute of champagne raised high. Beside him, Savannah glowed in a diamond-encrusted gown, playing the part of the blushing bride-to-be perfectly. "Tonight is about legacy," Julian announced, his voice booming through the speakers. "It is about building a future on the solid foundations of the past. And tonight I am not just celebrating 10 years of this hotel. I am celebrating the woman who has stood by me and the son who carries my name." To Savannah. To Leo. The crowd applauded politely. Savannah smiled, but Marco saw the tremor in her hand holding the glass. She was still rattled from the tasting menu, sensing a threat she couldn't name. "And now," Julian continued, "I'd like to invite the genius behind tonight's menu to say a few words about our vision, Mr. M.R. Sterling." Marco walked onto the stage. The spotlight hit him blindingly white. He approached the podium, placing his laptop down and connecting the HDMI cable with a definitive click. He adjusted the microphone. He looked out at the sea of faces. He saw Julian and Savannah stepping back, looking at him with expectant condescension. "Thank you, Mr. St. James," Marco said. His voice was different tonight. The gravelly, disguised tone was gone. In its place was the clear, resonant voice of the man who used to call orders in the kitchen downstairs. "We often talk about ingredients." Marco began, his eyes locking onto Savannah's. "We talk about purity, authenticity, but sometimes the most expensive dish is just a garnish hiding a rotten core." Savannah's smile faltered. Julian frowned. "I prepared a presentation for you tonight." Marco said, his hand hovering over the laptop. "A timeline of the St. James legacy." He pressed the spacebar. The massive LED screen behind him, which had been displaying the hotel logo, flickered. A photo appeared. It wasn't a hotel room, it was a hospital bed. A man lay in it, bandaged unconscious. The timestamp in the corner read November 12th, 2018. A murmur rippled through the crowd. 5 years ago, a man was injured in the kitchen of the Harbor View restaurant, Marco narrated calmly. He was fighting for his life. He pressed the key again. A screenshot of a text message filled the 20-foot screen. The font was massive, inescapable. From JSJ to my love timestamp, November 12th, 2018, 3:10 a.m. "Did he wake up yet? Just make sure you get the check before you leave him." The room went dead silent. The string quartet stopped playing. Julian's face went white. He stepped forward. "What is this? Cut the feed, security." "I wouldn't," Marco said, his voice cutting through the rising panic. "I have the microphone, and you have the floor, Julian." He hit the key again. Another slide. A bank transfer record. Workers' comp settlement, $150,000. Transferred to joint account. Withdrawn by Savannah Moore. Savannah gasped, clutching her chest. "Stop it! Turn it off!" "We're just getting to the main course," Marco said coldly. The screen changed again. This time it was a timeline. Date of conception, August 2018. Location, Chicago. Marco Rodriguez present. Julian Street, James in Paris. "You see," Marco said, turning to face Savannah, who was now trembling violently. "Math, like cooking, is an exact science." The final slide appeared. It was the PDF from the genetics lab. The conclusion was highlighted in red box that seemed to drip down the screen. Sample B, Leo Street. James, biological father, Marco Rodriguez. Probability 99.99%. The gasp from the crowd sucked the air out of the room. It was a physical shockwave. 500 pairs of eyes turned from the screen to Julian, then to Savannah, and finally to the man in black standing at the podium. Marco reached up and slowly removed his tinted glasses. He looked directly at his wife. "Hello, Savannah," he said softly, the microphone picking up every nuance. "Did you enjoy the cacio e pepe?" Savannah screamed a raw, horrified sound of recognition. She stumbled back, tripping over her gown, and fell hard onto the stage. Julian stood frozen, staring at the screen, then at the boy sitting at the family table with the nanny. He looked at Leo, really looked at him, and saw the truth he had ignored for 4 years. The dark eyes, the quiet demeanor. The boy wasn't his. "You," Julian whispered, turning on Savannah. "You lied. About everything." "Security." The hotel manager screamed from the back, but it was too late. The live stream had been running for 3 minutes. The world knew. Marco stepped back from the podium. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He stood center stage, watching the house of cards collapse, dust and debris flying everywhere, while he remained untouched. The kitchen was finally clean. The chaos that followed was not the frantic panic of a fire, but the brittle shattering of a frozen lake. The guests were murmuring, phones raised, capturing the destruction of the St. James dynasty in real time. Julian. St. James didn't scream. He didn't throw a punch. He did something far colder. He adjusted his cufflinks, stepped away from the woman, sobbing on the floor, and looked at his head of security. "Escort Ms. Moore off the premises," Julian said, his voice flat amplified by the microphone Marco had abandoned. "And have the locks on the penthouse changed immediately. She leaves with nothing but the dress on her back. Though frankly, I want the diamonds back first." "Julian, please," Savannah wailed, reaching for his pant leg. "I did it for you. I wanted to give you a son. You gave me a fraud." Julian spat, kicking her hand away as if it were a rat. "You made me a laughingstock. You're done, Savannah. You don't exist in this town anymore." Two burly guards hauled Savannah to her feet. She looked wild, her mascara running in black streaks down her face. The carefully constructed mask of the socialite completely dissolved. As they dragged her toward the exit, she locked eyes with Marco, who was standing calmly by the edge of the stage. She broke free from the guards with a desperate surge of strength and scrambled toward him. "Marco!" she gasped, grabbing the lapels of his suit. "Marco, baby, listen to me. I was scared. I was alone. I thought you were going to die. I did what I had to do to survive. You know me. You know I love you." Marco looked down at her hands, the hands that had left him to rot. He didn't shove her away. He simply reached up and peeled her fingers off his jacket one by one. "You don't love anyone, Savannah," Marco said. His voice wasn't angry. It was hollow, empty of any feeling whatsoever. "You love survival, and you love shiny things, but the shine wore off. We can start over," she pleaded, her voice dropping to a whisper. "We have the money now. We can take Leo. We can be a family." Marco stepped back, creating a chasm between them that no apology could bridge. "My lawyer is already with Leo and the nanny," Marco said. "The DNA results were sent to family court an hour ago. I have filed for emergency custody based on fraud and child endangerment. You won't be seeing him, Savannah. Not where you're going." He signaled to the guards. "Take her." As she was dragged out screaming his name, Marco didn't watch. He turned his back on the ballroom, on the stunned elite, on the wreckage of his former life. He walked down the stairs past the crying Julian, who was frantically on the phone with his PR team, and headed for the kitchen. The kitchen was empty. The staff had fled or were watching from the service corridor. It was quiet save for the hum of the refrigerators. Marco walked to his station. He picked up his knife roll, the leather case that held the only tools that had never betrayed him. He unrolled it on the stainless steel counter. The blades gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. He took out his chef's knife. It was clean, sharp, perfect. He grabbed a cloth and wiped it down one last time, a ritual of closure. He looked around the kitchen. This was where he had burned. This was where he had died. And this was where he had been reborn. The heavy double doors swung open behind him. It was Elias, the manager, looking pale. "Mr. Sterling, the police are outside. They want a statement. And Mr. St. James is threatening to sue." Marco didn't turn around. He slid the knife back into its sheath and rolled the leather case tight. "Let him sue," Marco said, tucking the roll under his arm. "He has no money left. The investors pulled out 10 minutes ago." He walked toward the back exit, the one that led to the alley, to the cold Chicago air, to the car where his son was waiting. He paused at the door, his hand on the push bar. He looked back at the empty, silent kitchen one last time. He had served the meal. The bill had been paid. Revenge is a dish best served cold, Marco whispered to the silence. But sometimes you have to burn the whole kitchen down first. He pushed the door open and walked out into the night, leaving the heat behind him forever.